the Sharp Aquos Crystal, a smartphone from 2014 with a striking design. With its frameless top and bottom bezels, this phone was immediately attention grabber, with a lot of popular YouTubers like MKBHD and Snazzy Labs reviewing it. Keep in mind that before this, Sharp was absolutely not known for their phones. Like seriously, the phone they released before this looked like this, and then they come out of nowhere with this very sleek device. It's no wonder why it was such an attention grabber. Most phones from that year looked like this, and it would be another 2 years until we saw a stab at ultra-thin bezels with the Xiaomi Mi Mix. But the Aquos Crystal is a strange device, if you ask me. For one, despite this looking like a flagship phone, this was very mid-range, with a Snapdragon 400 CPU, 1.5GB of RAM, and although the screen was bezel-less, it's only 720p, and they missed out big time by not going for an AMOLED display. And although this phone is sleek on the front, if you turn it on its side, you might barf. This phone is completely built out of plastic, which doesn't have to be a bad thing, but it was poorly executed here. It also has one of those peel-off backs, which allows you to access the SD card, but not the battery. And trust me, you're going to need an SD card because this thing only comes with 4 or 8GB of internal storage, which is pretty weak. And the 10mm thickness of this device does not complement its bezels very well. Also, the 8-megapixel camera on the back is basically unusable. And the front-facing camera is a 2-megapixel unit mounted at the bottom, and it's kind of funny, if you go into the camera app, it'll tell you to hold the phone upside down so you don't get selfies at a weird angle. And also one thing I would have liked to see in this huge chin, since they have it, are subtle capacitive buttons for the home, back, and multitasking screens. Because there's already huge chin back here, and I'd like to see as much of the screen used as possible. And although I might have just seemed to rant out a bunch of cons of this phone, there definitely are some pros. One of the coolest features, if you ask me, is the ability to take screenshots on this phone by just swiping across the top. That's the screenshot taken without having to do the weird thing with the power and home buttons. And despite this chipset, this phone actually is reasonably fast on stock Android KitKat. In fact, it's far faster than something like a Samsung Galaxy J3, which is beefier on paper but way slower on Android 7. Bloatware really does make a difference. One cool thing is that since it couldn't fit a headset speaker in this top bezel obviously, this uses a kind of piezoelectric form, which makes the whole front panel a speaker, so that way you can hear your call no matter what angle you put the phone into your ear. And it works admirably. And speaking of headset, this phone does have a headphone jack, although the internal DAC is noticeably absolutely garbage. Although honestly, I think it says something that this is a feature in the first place. But although, even if it had no more advantages, at least this phone was cheap. At $150, this was cheap back then, and even cheaper today when you can consider what a budget phone really is. And as far as the user market goes, you can pick a unit like this up easily for $20 or less. And if I had to choose between a cheap Walmart burner phone and this, I know what I'm choosing. When new phone technology comes out, it's usually in really expensive devices initially, but here, Sharp did something different. This futuristic device was relatively affordable, and was something that nobody else really had, especially for its price point. But although it's worth noting that Sharp did end up releasing a flagship version of this phone a year later called the Aquos XX. However, it wasn't as impressive as the original Aquos if you just look at it from the front. Because you can tell that the original Aquos is basically modeled after the screen, because of the other sacrifices it made. However, the Aquos XX was obviously modeled after being an actual phone. And don't get me wrong, the Aquos XX was still really impressive for 2015. Because the XX was thinner and houses a bigger battery, and for that they could get more traditional phone features and make it a better all-rounder. It has a better camera, it has a regular phone speaker, and they could fit a much faster flagship chipset in there. So that leads me to believe that the Aquos is basically kind of a novelty. You probably weren't wanting to use this as your main phone, and I can see why. You were probably showing this off to your friends to look cool, and hey, I can't be against that. Because if I was, I'd be disenfranchising every phone that tried something new, even if it was just to show off. These days, when you're looking at the front, I don't think even modern smartphones usually have bezels this thin, and I think there is some reasons for that. First of all, this Aquos is horrible in terms of durability. It just shatters upon impact because there's nothing shielding the glass from the ground. And cases were also equally hard to make for it, because there's nothing really for the case to grab onto. And besides that, I really think that the market has just moved on since then. People don't really care about the bezels being this thin as long as they're thin enough. Because I think most people would take a slightly thicker bezel if it meant they could get a 1080p OLED screen instead of the 720p one. And don't get me wrong, modern smartphones still have really thin bezels. I think there was a similar situation from when smartphones were getting really thin. Every year, Apple would brag about how thin their new iPhone was. The iPhone 6 had famously terrible battery life, but it was thin at least. That, and it was bent easily. The iPhone 12 Pro is actually thicker than the 6, but for that, engineers have fixed a lot. Same thing goes for Android phones. Just by being a bit thicker means that relatively huge advancements can be made, like optical zoom. There's so much allowed by just making that sacrifice. That was a bit of a tangent, but this does have to do with the Aquos. Because this phone is constructed strangely. The motherboard is in front of the battery, and repairability on this phone looks like absolute hell. And this battery was small for this kind of phone too, ranking it at only 2,000 something milliamp hours. But the thing is that sacrifice in the phone world, especially back then, is amazing. For those sacrifices, we got this. And nothing else looked like it. Wrapping this up though, I like this phone, even for its faults. It's a benchmark in history, and if you ask me, it's the reason why companies are doing what they do today. Every innovation takes part in that. However, this is Calc G, and I'm signing off.